Hi, I'm Tony. I'm an author, presenter at Sky Sports, and years ago I went to the jungle and got ill. Very ill. So this is my podcast adventure to find more energy. It's packed with biohacking, science, health tech, supplements, and some of the most well-known experts on the planet.
This is something I spent 4 months of my life doing with electrodes glued to my head so that you can do a lifetime worth of meditation.
Decide what you don't give a f*** about, which is something you don't care about.
Some of it gets quite out there.
I had some stem cells sent up to my house that I had stored, and then I injected myself with mannitol.
And we even hack hangovers.
Alcohol is poisonous. So is water and oxygen in the wrong dosage.
So that's my podcast, Zestology. Live life with energy, vitality, and motivation. Hello and welcome to the final podcast of 2020. For the final time this year, I'm huddled in the corner of the spare room, recording a podcast just for you, and it has to be said, 2020, you have a lot to answer for. But it's a bit of a tradition, me doing a review of the year in a kind of podcast format, and it has been a review of a very strange year this time around. And then at the end of the podcast, I will reveal the most popular podcast guest of 2020. I've been over the stats over the last half hour or so, and I found the most popular podcast, and I will reveal that, the big reveal at the end of the podcast. So today I am featuring 5 best-selling authors, doctors, Harvard professors, luminaries from all different walks of life, and a man who sells dog food. Mark Scott, you know I love you, and you do appear in this year's Review of the Year on Zestology. As well as that, of course, the guest who features on the most listened to podcast of 2020. Who was it, and why were they the most listened to guest? Well, all is revealed in today's podcast. So what a year. Let's cast our minds back to a more innocent time, and that is January 2020, when COVID was just a distant glimmer or a distant blot on the horizon, and we had no idea how serious it was going to be. And for not the first time, Katie Brindle was a guest on the podcast. Katie is the author of Yang Sheng, The Art of Chinese Self-Healing. She's been practicing Chinese medicine herself since 2002. And in January, we talked about, as I said, it was a more innocent time. All we had to worry about was what we were going to do every evening, and who we were going to socialise with, and who we were going to go out, and who we were going to stand at least within 1 meter's distance of. And we talked about the perils of overscheduling. Something at that point in my life I really needed. I don't anymore. Not got much of a life now, probably like you as well. But then I did. So here is Katie Brindle from January on Zestology.
I'm so overscheduled that there's zero enjoyment of anything because you just can't savour anything any longer. And it's also something I noticed in clinic, because whenever I see a patient, they're just always stressed. And when they start talking about their lives, they start effectively giving you a commentary on where we are as a society, which is family life, a very extended work life, a very high expectation of all the possibilities that we can actually have available to us, which in the old days simply weren't even there. And the net result is we're all flying around trying to cover all our bases and not necessarily actually having a good time in the process.
And everyone's saying the same thing, aren't they?
Yeah.
Everyone is overstressed, overbusy, got too many plans in, pushed at work, and then checking their email when they're not at work, and then not enough time for the family and everyone else and social life at weekends.
Right. And I think, the concept of kind of, less is more, but, savouring what you have. I mean, if I think back to like my nan, she's a good example, if she was doing something nice, you'd have the opportunity to actually, A, look forward to it, and then B, relish it at the moment in time of whatever it was. Whereas I found in contrast in my life, it's just, I sometimes look at my diary and actually feel slightly sick, because I just think, oh God, if I actually look at the week I've got to get through, I can't actually cope. So I'm just going to focus on and get through today.
I feel stressed thinking about it.
Yeah. And
your diary makes me feel stressed.
I'm not surprised. I mean, it's just a bit insane. But I then decided to basically apply the concept of JOMO, joy of missing out, which annoyingly then became a thing after I thought of it. I was really annoyed because I thought, hang on, I thought that ages ago. But JOMO, I think, is such a great concept where you just basically become super discerning and you think, right, okay, I need to have bandwidth in my day for nothing, which in Chinese medicine is what we would call the yin, the rest. And the concept of just, I mean, I live in the country, so just sitting by the fire and just relaxing and just absorbing, everything that's been going on, rather than to feel the need to kind of, I don't know, put my kids to bed and then rush out down to the local pub to meet X, Y and Z and do whatever it was. I've tried where possible to be really discerning about my diary and allocate in my day time where there's nothing to do. And that's actually golden time.
So that was Katie Brindle in January and the perils of overscheduling. She has appeared again on the podcast since. And in fact, just before the second lockdown here in London, she and her mate Aaron Collins-Thomas, who are both Qigong experts, came and did some Qigong with me in my garden in London, which was excellent. And that was later in the year if you want to find that. Now in February, I think one of the really interesting things about Zestology is a lot of people get in touch with me and ask where they can get more testing, where they can measure their kind of health and wellness stats a little bit more extensively. So I did that with Beth O'Hara. I did some tests and she analysed them. So you can see what it is like if you work with a functional medicine practitioner. We called the podcast Are Allergies Killing Your Performance? Looking into histamine intolerance and MCAS. And really what it is Beth going over my stats. So, I mean, I think I know a lot of people got more involved in this area because of this podcast. I think it was fascinating. And here's a little dive into what Beth O'Hara had to say in February.
You said that you were traveling in the Philippines in 2014 and you got a virus.
Yes. I was in the Philippines and started off, I just, one day, just noticed this rash on part of my body and thought it might be sunburn, but it wasn't. And then started to get a weird numb patches on my forehead and didn't feel very well. Went to the doctor over there who said I had measles, which I don't think I did, but I had some kind of virus he could tell from my red blood cell count. And then came back, the neurological symptoms continued and I just didn't really have any energy, and I spent a couple of months in bed really and 3 months off work from Sky. And then really it took me about a year to get back to kind of approaching full energy. But when I went to the neurologist quite a few times and they just said, look, these kind of neurological symptoms, when you've had a virus and modern medicine can't diagnose that virus, often you get some kind of a post-viral neurological symptoms which we can't explain, and they eventually go away.
Okay, but you still have some of them.
I do, yeah.
Which tells me that at this point, we've got a really good panel that just came out this year called a Neural Zoomer.
Okay.
And that's a panel that looks at all kinds of things that can be going on with the neurological system. So that's something I'm going to flag here for you just based on your case history. And then I'll send you some notes here with some recommendations.
Continuing this Zestology review of the year, and as we got into March, immunity started to be more of an issue. But incredibly, on March the 6th, 2020, when Wade Lightheart was my guest, we still had no idea of the utter carnage that was to come and was to affect the whole world. Wade was one of my favourite guests this year, and Wade and I talked immunity and gut health, which was important then and is even more important now.
Every animal in the world, when it gets hurt, fasts so it can use its natural production of enzymes to heal the body. Right? Second thing, by the time we're 40, most of us have less than 30% of not only the enzymes that we had when we were a child, but also the hydrochloric acid when we were as a child. So people start getting acid reflux or heartburn, or they start to notice they can't have that glass of wine anymore because it gives a burning sensation or an inflammatory.
Yeah.
Right? These are the things that come up. And then finally, because of the widespread use of antibiotics, foods that don't have the natural probiotics present on it because of irradiation and antibacterial methodologies of the modern world, which had its benefits. But there's consequences and benefits to everything. We've altered our gut microbiome, high levels of stress, looking into blue light all the time with our computers and our phones and all this stuff has compromised how that microbiome works. And that oftentimes allows people not have enough energy, or they're not able to recover and build their bodies. And as we age, the whole system just tends to degenerate, especially if you're living in the modern world. I mean, who has Not everybody can be living in Hawaii eating perfectly fermented fruits and vegetables and growing things and taking everything out of the garden every day. That's the modern world we live in. So those are the challenges. And so the three areas where people get the most benefit: enzymes before meals, hydrochloric after, and then probiotics, depending on the probiotic, either in the evening or at different times during the day, depending on the strain.
And happily, Wade's company, Bioptimizers, makes Magnesium Breakthrough, which are the podcast partners for today's podcast, and an excellent product it is as well. I've been using it, certainly for the last year or so, and I use it every day. I've literally just had some Magnesium Breakthrough today. And you'll hear a little bit more about that in just a second. But before that, what an incredible time March was. And I will never forget one particular day in my day job working at Sky here in the UK. And I was at work, and it was the day that the dawning horror of what was affecting the world seemed to kind of come upon us. And it was a Friday afternoon, and I was presenting with a colleague. Of course, there was no social distancing because we didn't realise we had to at that point, although in retrospect, I think I had COVID-19 at that point, and my partner had a positive antibody test, although I didn't. And on this Friday afternoon, when I went on air about 2:00, things were looking bad, but not insurmountable. By 6:00, the global situation had completely changed, and in the space of about 4 hours, almost all the sporting events around the world that we normally cover on Sky had been cancelled in the space of 4 hours. It was one of the hardest work shifts that I've ever done as a journalist, because I think there was so much uncertainty about what was to come, and so much, from my perspective, so much emotion and sadness about what people were about to go through, not just in terms of their health, but in terms of being locked down, not being able to go to work, losing their livelihoods and everything else. A very, very challenging shift. And by March the 30th, when I got Dr. Matt Cook on, everything had changed, hadn't it? The schedule for Zestology had gone completely out of the window. Normally, I prepare these podcasts a couple of months in advance. So as you listen to this, I'll probably have a month or two, at least, kind of a little bit of a schedule planned. And sometimes I'll pre-record a couple of interviews a few weeks in advance, so I've got them ready. I never like to kind of think, oh, it's Saturday, what am I going to put out on Monday? And when it got to the end of March, I did that. I just threw everything out the window, and I got guests on who could help us look at the health and wellness implications of COVID-19 and coronavirus. This podcast is all about energy, vitality and motivation. And at that point, none of us were feeling much of it. And we definitely wanted to concentrate on immunity, the immune system, antivirus support, and what at that point, naturally, we could do to boost our health. Here is a bit of Dr. Matt Cook and I talking about that incredible time back in March.
Ozone therapy is I think will end up being the most effective therapy. If we sit down and talk in 2 years and we look back at coronavirus and we look at the data, I think we'll find that ozone therapy is going to be the most effective thing. I think the regenerative therapies are going to end up being quite helpful in terms of taking care of some of the post-COVID complications that some people get, the pulmonary scarring, and so I think we'll find some very interesting evidence around that. The challenge is these just are not widely accepted by traditional medicine, and so we need to get some data out there and prove it to them.
There you go. That was Dr. Matt Cook on Zestology in March. We'll be back with this podcast in a moment, but before that, got to tell you about my podcast partners for December. And it is all about a product that will help you with stress. And often we focus on solutions like meditation, going to the spa, dealing with tense relationships, whatever it might be, spending less time in traffic. But what if the root cause of so much stress that we experience comes down to none of these things really making much difference, but a deficiency of one overlooked nutrient, and that nutrient is magnesium. Magnesium is the body's master mineral. It powers over 300 critical reactions, including detoxification, fat metabolism, energy, very relevant to this podcast, and stress, and even digestion. And if there's one mineral that loads of us are deficient in, the studies have shown it is magnesium. It is an absolute staple for me. I've been taking magnesium, pretty much since the start of this podcast back in 2014. I've been on magnesium every day, and definitely now Magnesium Breakthrough, my podcast partner for December. And Zestology's been able to arrange for us a little bit of stock to be set aside just for Zestology listeners. I guarantee this is the best deal available on Magnesium Breakthrough anywhere. If you head to bioptimizers.co.uk and use the code Zestology10, you will be able to get use your coupon code to get 10% discount on Magnesium Breakthrough. You can actually save up to 40% on some packages. So that's bioptimizers.co.uk. Use the code Zestology10. If you're in America, then head to bioptimizers.com/Zestology for all the deals there. And remember that Bioptimizers is spelt with a Z. It's the American spelling. If the root of so much stress that we experience does come down to a deficiency of magnesium, it's worth sorting out. And for me, it's not just stress. I really notice it. This might not be the technical term, but I get twitchy legs when I don't take enough magnesium, especially at night and especially early in the morning. If I've forgotten Magnesium Breakthrough the day before, if I've forgotten to take some magnesium at night, I definitely get the early morning twitchy legs and I wake up early. And of course, that affects my energy levels as well. You won't find this deal on Amazon or anywhere else. Magnesium Breakthrough, definitely the most effective magnesium supplement I've ever tried, and that is because you don't need to have 7 different bottles of magnesium to get the complete dose. You can get one, and it is an absolute pleasure to talk about Magnesium Breakthrough on this podcast. I'm very proud that they are a podcast partner. Bioptimizers.co.uk, use the code Zestology10. Back to the show. Into April and May and lockdown for many people around the world, and Julia Samuel MBE, who, as coincidence would have it, her book came out at an excellent time. She wrote a book about dealing with circumstances as they happen, and it is called This Too Shall Pass. And it covers lots of extremely important and deep themes, not least grief, and I think was particularly relevant for the pandemic, for what people have gone through in 2020. And Julia Samuel, MBE, came on Zestology in May.
When someone comes through my door, one of the first things they say to me is, oh my goodness, please don't tell me I'm going to feel like this forever. When is it going to change?
Yeah.
And my response is that it is incredibly painful. So you have to acknowledge the pain that they're in. You can't diminish it by saying, don't worry, you're going to get over it, mate.
Yes. Yeah, I wasn't suggesting you do that, but yeah.
But also that it is likely that over time it changes, the level of the intensity of the pain changes, and it takes longer than you want or that you would choose. But the key, given that you're in this much pain now, is to find the support within yourself and from other people to support you through it, that you can't hit your head against this, you can't will your way around it, you can't Marie Kondo your feelings into tidy little drawers. You have to allow those feelings of pain and loss to run through your system so that your system adapts and change with this new reality. And that is as true of a living loss like COVID as it is a death.
Well, this is the Zestology review of the year, and a little bit later on I'll be telling you what was the most popular podcast of 2020. I've saved it for the end. But before that, at the end of May, I was in need of a little dose of positivity. So friend of the show and a guest who's been on many times in the past, Celest Pereira, came on again, and we talked anatomy.
Now, if you had to survive with nothing but your bare hands, you would be lifting loads all day long. You would be lifting children and food and water and building materials from the morning till the night just to ensure survival. But what do we lift these days as modern people? We have our shopping delivered to our doors. We lift our iPhone and our laptops if we have to go from room A to room B, but we don't actually get that same amount of load through our posterior chain. And remember, that's going back to the posterior chain I was chatting about later. Think about every time you lift your baby up, what should be engaging is all the muscles of your back body go into what we call a concentric activation, which means they shorten as you stand up. And that activation is what gives you, again, standing up, holding baby. That load is being held with your posterior chain. Of course, other things are moving as well, but that movement from low to high is, of course, your posterior chain. Now, if we're living in modern life and we don't have that load going into the posterior chain, of course, if you don't use it, you lose it. So we atrophy, the muscles get weaker, they start disappearing. And so, yes, you do want to be doing your, tums and bums. I think that's what you really want to call it. Hey, Tony. But
Tums and bums.
tums.
Yeah.
Tums and bums. That's what you're doing every day, isn't it?
So I'm doing pretty much every day. And to be honest, I feel great after I do it.
You will feel good. You will feel good. So, and this was my point. Yes, these things are fantastic, especially from a rehab perspective. But it's not necessarily giving your body what it needs in terms of natural evolutionary movements. So if you could buy some kettlebells for your home, or maybe some resistance bands, keep doing PVOL. Don't ever stop. I think it's fantastic that you're doing this, but I think it's important to maybe, as you progress, add in some of those loads that you would have if you were in nature.
From one friend of a show to another, and John Gray, the author of the biggest selling non-fiction book the world has ever seen in hardback form, Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus. John Gray came on to talk relationships, and specifically at the start of June, lockdown relationships. At this point, there was a lot in the press about how our relationships had been tested to breaking point by what was going on with lockdown. And it's hardly surprising when you're cooped up with someone for the weekend, sometimes that's too much. But when you're not used to being in the same house with someone 24/7 and you're forced to spend 3 months with them, that for some people proved too much. And so John Gray talked about lockdown relationships and how to make them work in his own unique way.
This is very challenging to so many people. So I don't like to get too light about this. I mean, one is some people are losing family members, and that's terrible. I mean, that's the grieving, and I totally understand that. And then there's the Wuhan, where they've sort of been through a lot of this before. When they started coming out of their houses, when the lockdown was released, divorce rates went from the average in Wuhan is generally 12 divorces a week, and they went to 300 a week, and still there's big lineups of people wanting to get divorced. It's really, really hard if people don't have significant relationship skills, and the way I summarize it is an ideal relationship, and it's a range here, but is 80% of your happiness and fulfillment is independent of your relationship. We are whole people before we get married, before we fall in love and so forth. We have a life. And, often when couples are having so many problems, the solution is take some time to go back to your life and find your happiness. And then you go to your relationship in order to give more because you got more. And then by giving more, you get more. And so your partner can make you happier. That's the job we have with each other, really, is not to make each other happy. That's our own job, but it's to make each other happier. And that happens by being full within ourselves. And, the problem with it is although I don't feel it's my job to make my partner happy, many men, and it's not their job if we look at the man side of it, but men get in the way and they make it worse. Because so many times part of the journey for women to find their happiness is to talk about what's bothering them. And so normally they'd have their friends. 80% of the time they've got life to experience what's bothering them. And suddenly it's just him or the kids. You're stuck in this place and you don't have a lot of other reasons to be bothered. And you don't have a lot of other moments to share your feelings with other friends or whatever and interact. You don't have a lot of stimulation that would normally soothe your soul because you're doing all these things that you enjoy or you're making a difference in the world. So that's the 80%. And now when you're stuck together, there's a tendency to feel like, well, you're supposed to make me happy. And although people don't articulate that so clearly, oh, you're not doing your job to make me happy, the way it shows up is I'm not feeling very good in your presence. You're making me feel bad. See, when you feel like your partner is responsible for your annoyance, for your irritation, or they're annoyed and irritated with you, and now you're annoyed and irritated with them. The problem is we're blaming our partner is a sign. Don't believe what you're feeling right now. Don't believe what you're thinking right now. If you're thinking all this negativity or you're having all this irritation, don't believe it. Recognize it's like a boil. It's a sickness that you can heal by clearly saying to yourself, stop, stop, stop. I need to take time for myself and not be blaming them. I'm a grown-up. I'm not a child. I'm not dependent on them for my happiness. I'm responsible for my happiness. And I have no right to blame them.
Well, I've already said that because of the pandemic, because of everything that's gone on this year, the Zestology schedule looked very different by the time we got to the middle of the year than I thought it was going to. Normally, I meticulously plan it out. I've got dates and times and which guest will be where. But this year, it all kind of fell by the wayside. Sarah Knight was supposed to be start of March, but she ended up being middle of July. She's still as brilliant as ever. The No Fucks Given best-selling author came back on Zestology.
A few years ago, the first book came out, The Life-Changing Magic of Not Giving a Fuck. And that book is really focused on getting to know in your own mind, really understanding that it's okay to not want to do things, to not give a fuck about things, and to not give your fucks in the form of your time, energy, and money to things that don't make you happy. And, over the years, as I've written the other No Fucks Given guides, people keep writing to me and saying, some version of, I read your first book, I get it, I'm on board, I understand that it's okay not to give a fuck, but how do I say no to things? And so I realized that people were really looking for, the literal words to be put in their mouths. So that is how Fuck No was born.
Okay, and I know you divide people up into different categories, don't you? What categories are there, and what would I be?
So there are four major categories of yes men, and you have the people pleasers, the overachievers, the FOMOers, people who have fear of missing out, and just the pushovers. And so I don't know exactly which category you would fall in, but there is a quiz in the book called the Why Do I Say Yes All the Goddamn Time quiz. And that should help readers. That's a diagnostic tool for readers so that they can figure out why it is that they are saying yes when they really want to say no. And then the rest of the book explains how they can walk that back and go from yes, man to no, ma'am.
Yeah, I mean, that's quite interesting just listening to your categories there. Well, I mean, without blowing my own trumpet, probably a bit of an overachiever, probably a little bit of a people pleaser. In that I've always been quite kind of good at oiling the wheels of social interaction. Yeah, I probably don't like kind of putting people's hackles up that much, but you strike me as someone who genuinely walks the walk. You don't really care what people think of you. Is that fair to say?
That is entirely fair to say. I think that I used to care more, and it was probably still had its roots in me being an overachiever and really caring about what I did and what I accomplished and how I was seen through the lens of being an ambitious, successful person. So even back in the day, I don't think I cared quite so much what other people thought of me. It was just an extension of what I thought of me. And now I am cutting myself a lot more slack. So it's good all around.
One of the things I've focused on in quite a lot of detail this year is breath work and the importance of breathing. It sounds so basic, doesn't it? Well, I breathe already. Why do I need to focus on it? But it can make an incredible difference to your life. Breathing properly is essential for our health and happiness, as James Nestor told me on July the 27th.
I was having a number of respiratory problems. I kept getting mild pneumonia, bronchitis, and wheezing. Even though I was pretty fit, I was working out all the time, I just kept having all these breathing problems. So I went to this class where they were doing this vigorous pranayama, which is this really intense breathing technique. And I sweated through my socks, and there were sweat blotches on my jeans. My hair was sopping wet. After about 10 minutes of just sitting in a chilly room, cross-legged, and breathing. And I thought, wow, this was a very interesting experience. So I asked my doctor, I said, what happened? And she said, oh, you must have had a fever, or the heat must have been up in the room. So she had zero explanation for what happened. But, I'm a journalist. I write about science, and my one experience I didn't think merited any real research into the subject until I discovered free divers. And these are people who are able to dive on a single breath for 300, 400 feet, stay underwater 8, 9, 10 minutes at a time. So they had mastered this other side of breathing. And they told me that mastering that power of breath extended beyond just diving deep and diving long. It had all these other applications. So it was at that point where I thought, wow, there's a much bigger story in this. And I was excited to pursue it.
I was reading that bit about you going to that class in the introduction, and that made me think that it would resonate with me, because one of the things that I find persistently happens is my circulation isn't very good. I get very cold hands and feet, especially in winter. And reading how you were kind of, your circulation got a lot better and your heart rate got up and you started to sweat and all the rest of it, that made me think I could apply some of that. Is circulation one of the ways that if you get the breath right, and one of the things that you investigated, you can really make a difference?
Absolutely. So much of blood pressure is correlated to how we breathe. And that includes, it extends to circulation. It extends what hormones are in your body at a certain time. It extends to digestion, mental state. I mean, there's a whole laundry list of things that are connected to how we breathe. And of course they are. This is our most basic biological function. So, but what I found was, even in medical communities, people are just concerned that they're breathing. If they're breathing, that's great. They're alive. If they're not breathing, that's a serious problem. We need to get them breathing again. But what I've found is those nuances of the 25,000 breaths we take every day matter as much as what you're eating or how much you're exercising. It's that important. And it was interesting to go into this world and talk to these scientists and researchers who are finding scientific proof for so many wild claims from the past.
Yeah, and I like the fact that you come from a kind of a background of writing about science, because it's always nice if there's something kind of concrete to back everything up, that it's not just a kind of woo-woo, look, you do this for an hour and you'll feel so much better. I like a bit of evidence.
Yeah, there's so many books on how to breathe right. You could go to a library and there's dozens and dozens of books, and some of these extend, they're thousands of years old. So the how of it's easy, but what I didn't find is the why and the what and where this stuff came from. And, someone's personal experience is okay, but I have no interest in writing a spiritual memoir. I wanted to understand this from the inside so that other people reading the book could also understand what was happening to their own bodies. If they're using breath to get healthier for athletic endurance, or if they're sick and they have respiratory problems, and where those problems came from and how to fix them. So it seemed like there was this huge gap in medical literature where they're just looking at pathologies. I'm not pointing fingers. If I break my leg, I'm not going to breathe. I'm going to go to the hospital, get it fixed. But they're looking at pathologies. But there's this whole other side that so many other people have been looking at, and especially lately, of using breathing for preventative maintenance and using breathing to alter different mental states, access energy. And that's where I found this to be very, very interesting.
This is the Zestology Review of the Year, if you want to give it its posh title. The informal title is 2020, You Have a Lot to Answer For. And as I've said already, I've had best-selling authors on here, doctors, Harvard professors, and I'm now very honoured to welcome to Zestology a man who sells dog food. It is Mark Scott, and I know he won't mind me saying that. He ate like a dog, quite literally, and did some research. And it was really enjoyable talking to Mark. I have a feeling I'd love to, when kind of everything eases, which hopefully will be at some point next year, I'd love to spend some time with Mark properly and hang out with him, because he's got so much to offer and he's such an interesting bloke and great company as well. So Mark Scott came on in August and told us about eating like a dog.
So I wanted to take everything I've learned from biohacking and put it into the dog world. That's basically what I wanted to do. So everyone, even if you look at the terminology, people call themselves pet parents. So the fact that they call themselves a parent is they put their dog as a child in their mind, which is great. And I think in most households today, it's who have got a dog, it's dog, mother, kids, father, or sometimes it's furniture, then father. That's the hierarchy in one family. So I thought, well, the only way I can get the message through to people is by humanizing dogs. So what I decided to do is, I've never understood why in the cat and dog world, the medical profession insists that processed food is better than natural food. I just don't get it. Because if you went to your doctor, Tony, and you said, and he asks you what you eat, which they never do. They never ask you what you put in your mouth. And you say, oh, I eat fresh food. I eat, meat, fish, vegetables. And your doctor turned around to you and said, no, you shouldn't be doing that. You should be eating processed food, which is balanced. You'd get rid of your doctor. You wouldn't go back.
Yeah.
But that's exactly what happens with vets. They recommend highly processed food over fresh food. So I thought, well, the only way I can explain this to most people who have a pet is to show what happens to you as a human, what is happening to your dog. So I decided to create a human version of the food that we recommend to dogs. And to do that, I had to eat processed food. So I ate lots of processed food, breads, pastas, ready meals from the supermarket. And I was eating things like, athletic greens and all this. So I made sure I hit the RDA. So I hit all the minimal vitamins and micronutrients.
Yeah.
Just like what's in dog food. Because my point with being was, these foods are recommended by the medical profession because they meet what they call the FEDIAF criteria, which is basically all these things have to have the right minerals and vitamins and all these kind of things in them. So in effect, they don't look at the ingredients that goes in with these minerals, which is a big issue. Because in effect, and I jokingly put there, that I could get a bag of sand and I could get a mix of FEDIA and minerals and stuff and mix it together. In effect, it could pass the FEDIAF approval because it's got the minerals and the vitamins and everything. So they don't look at the actual ingredients that's going in with those minerals.
Right. Yeah.
So I wanted to prove the same. And what happened was when I did it to myself, you can see from the photographs in the weight gain, I put 2 stone on in 2 months.
Did you? So you were hitting kind of minimum nutritional standards, but that's all you were hitting.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. I didn't take into any account of the fact it might have been in a massive pork pie or lasagna or whatever. So that was how I could prove that what happens to the body. And then I measured it through the Oura Ring and a whole heap of other, just to show you what's happened to my body.
Yeah, I saw on the blog you wrote, you had kind of various Oura graphics, and it's great. It's really fascinating.
So it was just to show, because it's difficult to get the ring on my dog. so I just wanted to show what was happening internally and externally, because often you get the people saying, I feed my dog dry dog food and they look good. Well, I know lots of people who smoke who also look good until they don't. And that's the problem with all these things is unless you see, things are happening. And even when they do see things happening, they never connect the dots together, like itchy skin. We get it on ourselves. And I showed that in my blog post that I started to get dry skin on my body, which I've not had for years when I started eating the processed food. And it's exactly one of the biggest things that dogs get is itchy skin. Over 50% of dogs in the UK are obese. 50%.
Right.
So it's when you look at all this, the experiment just showed basically what happened after 2 months. And then within 1 month, I tried to do what I call a species appropriate diet, which is what we do for dogs. So
you for the first month you ate crap basically.
For the first 2 months I ate crap.
For the first 2 months, and then you changed.
I changed and I went onto my species appropriate diet.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
For humans, as I would for what we create for dogs and cats.
Yeah.
And then you have that switch, and I'm sure you have done the keto and all that, and you go through that stage.
Yeah, I have actually. Yeah.
And that whole feeling terrible, and the toxins are coming out, the fats, and all this stuff that you feel. And for the first 2 weeks, you absolutely feel worse than worse. But by the 3rd and the 4th week, you start adapting to the keto. Now, I wasn't necessarily going into keto diet for keto's sake. I was just thinking, if I was going to eat like I am in the UK right now, because if I look at my my ancestry is Northern European, so I try to eat like a Northern European. So, for example, there's no sugars really in the wild right now. You don't get the sugars until the end of the summer.
Right. Yeah.
Where you get the fruits and stuff like
that. Don't say I'm not allowed to eat ice cream anymore.
Well, you can. I'm no judge. And by the way, I'm not perfect. Yeah. But then the sugars indicate to the body that, hey, you're at the end of summer, winter's coming, it's time to put some fat on. Let's start burning the sugars and store the fat. And the problem when you're eating carbohydrates and especially in kibble, because that's how they make the kibble, is using a lot of carbohydrates, is it's saying to the body, hey, you're at the end of the summer, let's store fat, let's store fat, let's store fat, let's store fat, rather than eating seasonally.
Yeah.
So when I cut out the sugars and I ate a high fat diet, suddenly my weight came off and I lost 1.5 stone. Actually, I've lost more than that in just over 4 weeks.
Yeah.
Just
wow.
By doing that. And it wasn't like I was doing anything. I was doing less exercise because in the first 2 weeks I was knackered, man.
So when you say you were eating like a dog, it was a species appropriate diet. It was the equivalent of what you'd give the dog.
Yes.
Yeah.
So what I did is I ate the processed version of what a dog eats.
Yeah.
And then I ate what we create as a species appropriate, i.e. raw, with because when we're doing dog food, if you look at our ingredients on the side of our box, all you see it's chicken. You know what chicken is? It's liver, it's kidneys, it's heart.
Yeah.
All the things that you would get if you ate an animal.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because that's what dogs would do. They would eat from top to tail.
Yeah.
The whole thing. So that's what we mimicked in the for the dogs, and I tried to mimic that as much as I could on my diet, appropriate for a human being, to show you what the difference was.
Yeah. Were you eating raw food or cooked food yourself? No,
so I was eating cooked meats, but I was eating it from my garden. So I was eating salads, curly kale, whatever was growing in my garden at the time is what I was eating, and that I would eat as much as I could raw. But definitely, obviously, meat and fish I was eating cooked.
From Mark Scott to who I think was the most important guest of 2020 on Zestology and has had the biggest impact on my health personally, it is Dr. Dale Bredesen and the perfect diet for your brain.
We're just trying to drive you to a biochemistry that actually works better for your brain. And what is that biochemistry? Well, number one, it is mild ketosis and getting people in the 1.0 to 4.0 millimolar beta-hydroxybutyrate. We're actually working with a group now on a breathalyzer that we hope will make it much easier. But so far, the best way to check your ketones, no question, is through your blood, a little finger stick. Not difficult. Lots of people doing it.
Those breathalyzers are okay, but they don't work brilliantly, do they?
That's the issue so far. So the group is claiming that they're getting just as good a results with this as with finger sticks. We'll see. We're in the midst of testing that right now, so we'll know something quite quickly here. And then secondly, as you know, things like polyphenols and many of the nutrients that are coming from a plant-rich diet. It doesn't have to be all plants. It can be plant-rich, small amounts, fish, and pastured chicken and grass-fed beef. These are all great. And in fact, one of the things that I've been doing during COVID-19, which I find very helpful, is use Chronometer. It's easy to use. It's like Chronometer, like a watch, but simply without the H. And it's free, and you can look and see where do I stand with these various nutrients. These things are so helpful and so critical for your brain. So you do want to get good fats. And although we do start people who are on the downward spiral with getting their ketones, even if it takes some MCT oil, saturated fats, and now, by the way, there's some wonderful exogenous ketones that are out there. A KE1, one that I've been using recently, which I find very nice, but there are others that people use. Ketone salts and ketone esters. KE1 is a combination of those two, but there are others. And again, just helping. In the long run, you want to get into endogenous ketosis, but in the short run, just to get things rolling, you can start with exogenous ketosis, and then you can move over and do it endogenously after a few months. So these are critical pieces. And then I mentioned the flexitarian part. Again, meat or no meat, but make sure that you get enough good fats. You want to get, somewhere around down only to 10 or 15% of your calories coming from carbs. And you want these to be complex carbs, not simple carbs. And then, your protein, you want to get somewhere around 0.5 to 1 gram per kilogram of protein. And then you want to get the rest of your calories from good fats, things like avocados and polyunsaturates and things like that.
And presumably combining the fats and the carbs is really not a good thing.
So you don't you don't want to be, this is exactly why you want to go out and hurt your brain, have a cheeseburger and some fries and a Coke. That'll definitely get you going on the right track to having poor cognition. And again, this has been published repeatedly. This is nothing new. Yeah. It's just something where so many doctors tell you, it's not really that important. And I was taught that in medical school. It's not a big deal. It's all about writing the right prescriptions. And it turns out that in fact it's a huge deal, as you know.
Well, we're looking back over some of the highlights, or you might say lowlights, of 2020 on this podcast. The podcast all about energy, vitality and motivation. And Donna Lancaster and I in October set our minds to thinking, how can we be happy even when the world is a bit shit?
It sounds so simple, and we know about mindfulness and we know the benefits of meditation, as you do only too well. But it really is so essential that we don't just believe what we think without question.
Right, yeah. And how would you do that?
But by becoming in a way, you start to do what I call personal inquiry, where you actually write down your thoughts. So you write down like, I'm thinking, this is what I'm thinking about the pandemic as an example. And you say, I'm thinking that, we're doomed. I'm thinking, we're going to die. I'm thinking I'm going to die. All the things that are the worst case scenarios that the mind will go to. And then you start to really question it as in, well, first of all, you need to become the observer of your thoughts. Every spiritual teaching, every meditation practice teaches you to observe your thoughts rather than be swept along by them. So the first step is to be able to kind of take a step back from your thinking. And that's a practice, it's a skill to be able to do that, to be able to say, there I go with my what I call the Doomsville story. Do you know what I mean? It's like there's my mind, it's running, and it's running off with my thoughts around we're all doomed. And so when you start to take a step back and observe your thoughts doing what they do, which is they're interested in your survival, your mind is interested in keeping you alive. So it's doing what it's meant to do. Where's the danger? What's needed here? How do I survive? That's where all the anxiety and fears come in. But the more you can start to first of all question your thoughts by writing them down and saying, okay, I'm making up this story, but I could also make up another story, because they are stories, Tony. Do you know what I mean? They're a series of thoughts that we replay on a loop in our heads that become the story of the pandemic. And I have a different story to other people, and certainly some of my clients. And that means that I'm a lot calmer.
That was Donna Lancaster, and the week after I spoke to Brett Moran in Thailand on lockdown. Thailand's borders have been closed for about 10 months, but Brett lives there and therefore he has stayed there. And whilst he's totally and completely sympathetic to the plight of millions around the world, lockdown hasn't been all bad for him.
A lot of people might be listening to this, in lockdown or in a bit of fear and anxiety through whatever they're hearing. To be honest with you, Tony, the last few months of my life have probably been the best. It's been absolutely amazing. I've traveled around to Bangkok. I'm in Phuket right now learning how to surf. I wrote half of a novel that I've been meaning to write for years. Launched some meditation programs, kind of made more money. Then my business has been amazing in the last few months. It's an online business. And honestly, mate, every day I'm with my friend at the moment. We're surfing and doing yoga every day. Every single day we just look at each other and say how grateful we are, because we know that the world is in this whole fear and pandemic and stuff, and everybody's lost a lot of freedom. We just can't believe how free we are. We're so grateful. So I'm just going to be, really, really honest. It's just been absolutely amazing, mate, to be honest with you. And I really want to share that, because the reason why I want to say it, not to show off, but I think where I'm living now and the lifestyle that I've created over these years, this is just a cause and effect, you know. And I think it's really important for people to think about the choices and the decisions or the careers or the paths that they're on now and where they're going in the future, because this level of freedom that I've got, I think, is because of the choices that I've made over the years and living abroad and living on islands like 4 or 5 years ago. So that whole pandemic and the lockdown thing, I haven't really noticed it, Tony, if I'm honest.
Brett Moran on Zestology, and let's move to the end of October. 2020 has not been funny, has it? It has a lot to answer for. So in a year that has decidedly not been funny, it's important to retain our sense of humour.
In this context that we're living in right now, with the shift to remote work and everything else that's going on in our world, you know, many of us have never felt more disconnected from our colleagues, from our loved ones. And with that comes increased rates of depression, of loneliness. You know, and so this is a really hard time for us as a society for many reasons. And while humor may seem really frivolous in that context, right? We've got a global pandemic, we've got systemic racism, a climate crisis. You know, we've all got to remember to shower at least once a week. It's in these sort of moments where gravity and disconnection are greatest that levity can actually be most powerful, that this is when we need humor the most. And there are a few aspects of well-being that I think are really powerful here. First is humor and laughter's impact on community and on our sense of connection.
Right.
So when we laugh with someone, we connect in a really powerful way. Neurochemically, laughing together, there's just nothing like laughter. Actually, in some ways, it's very similar to a runner's high. So I will say there's one thing like laughter, and that's sort of a runner's high. Yeah. But it really gives you more bang for your buck when it comes to interpersonal connection than just about anything else. And this is in part because when we laugh, our brains release the hormone oxytocin. And so when you and I are laughing together, we may be, you know, hundreds of thousands of miles apart, but our brains are firing with the same hormones at the same time, telling us to trust each other, telling us that this is a safe relationship, that this is a positive relationship, and that you know, maintains whether we're in a room together or whether we're across the world. And so why this is powerful, not just in that moment when we laugh together, but particularly relevant for you know, couples who are quarantining and having challenges with their partnerships right now, is when we recall moments of shared laughter, we become more satisfied in our relationships. So there was one study, one of my favorite studies, where researchers had two groups of couples reminisce about moments from their relationships. So in the first group, they had partners reminisce about positive moments. So Tony, tell me about a really just a positive moment that, you know, that you two have shared. And they had them, you know, tell stories about those positive moments. In the other group, they had people reminisce about moments of shared laughter. So tell me about a time that you really laughed together. And by the way, they had other control groups like, you know, a negative time, a neutral time, that sort of thing. But these are the groups that we really care about. And what researchers found was that the group who had reminisced about moments of shared laughter later reported being 23% more satisfied in their relationship than the other group, than the group who had just reminisced about positive moments.
Wow.
And so these moments of shared laughter, not only do they impact us neurochemically in the moment, but they bolster our sense of community and our relationships over time.
That was Naomi Bagdonas on Zestology, the author of a book all about humour and how to introduce that into your life more effectively, and how you can improve yourself and be happier and more successful by using humour. And one of my favourite podcasts as well. If you want to go back and check it, it was podcast number 296. Right, who was the guest that featured most? Who was the most listened to podcast of 2020? It is time to reveal it here on Zestology. And the podcast that was listened to more than any other was the very first podcast of the year. It was Dr. David Sinclair, podcast number 252, if you want to go back and listen to it. And it was all about living 14 years longer just by listening to this podcast, which admittedly was a pretty eye-catching title. Dr. David Sinclair is the world's foremost longevity expert, and over the course of the podcast, he outlined his favourite practices, diet tips, supplements, and more for increasing the quality and length of your life. And what he said in the podcast was this. He said, if you follow the program that he outlines, you'll live 14 years longer. To which I said, I'm in.
We discovered a link between a set of genes called sirtuins and longevity. And this was when I was a postdoctoral researcher at MIT. And we were studying yeast cells and trying to figure out why do they age and can we slow it down? And these genes turned out to be really important for controlling the aging process. And we could put in more copies of the SIR2 gene, it was called, and the yeast would live 30% longer by mimicking calorie restriction or fasting. And so we had a handle on the genes that provide the health benefits of fasting. And in our bodies, we now believe things like exercise are driven by these sirtuin genes. We have 7 of them in our bodies. And in the early 2000s, we were looking for easier ways to turn on these sirtuin genes than gene therapy. And we came across a group of molecules that are made by stressed plants. And the most potent one at the time was called resveratrol. And you can find a lot of it, relatively a lot of it, in red wine.
Yeah.
Still not enough of it to treat a disease, that's for sure. You only have a couple of milligrams in a glass at best. Pinot Noir has the highest. But it's a good source over the long run. I have taken resveratrol, and I continue to take resveratrol about a teaspoonful into my yogurt every morning, a little yogurt that I make myself. And I do that based on a lot of research. Some has been published by my lab, where if we give mice resveratrol, they are seemingly totally immune to a Western diet, and they live as long as a lean one. And if you combine resveratrol with calorie restriction, or intermittent fasting, I should call it, they live even longer combined. And it has very little downside. We haven't seen any negative effects. And other labs have shown protection against the cardiovascular system, against diabetes, against cancer. So the upside looks promising. There have been some clinical trials that have gone well and shown lowering of glucose, lowering of cholesterol. Admittedly, there have been some clinical trials that have failed to show any benefits. And I think the reason is that resveratrol is very insoluble. And if you just take a dry powdered pill of this stuff, it's not going to get absorbed. We know that from mice. We know that from humans. And that's the reason I mix it with yogurt. But yeah, things look good. My cardiovascular system, my health, my age are all on track for me to live a relatively long life, despite my terrible genetics that I inherited. But yeah, I'm experimenting on myself, not because I'm trying to live forever. I really don't actually care when I die. I'd rather not die than die. But what I'm trying to do is to push science faster. I mean, I don't want us all to be born one generation too early. And if we don't hurry up, we will be that generation.
That is Dr. David Sinclair, the most listened to guest on Zestology this year. All that remains for me to say is thank you for listening to this podcast. I hope you have a very Merry Christmas. Might be slightly different to usual, I guess, but I hope it's good for you, and I hope you have a good festive season. I will be back, as usual, on the 1st of January with a snappily titled podcast. I'm quite pleased with the title of my first podcast of next year. And the podcast is called First Rule of 2021, Never Talk About 2020. My guest is a man who's been on many times before on Zestology. In fact, it's become a bit of a tradition that we do a podcast on the first day of the year together. It's Dr. Stephen Simpson. So we went for a walk last week and we were chatting all the way through. And we just couldn't quite work out how to make our walk turn into a podcast with microphones and social distancing. So then we spoke. So what it was like a kind of prep session for the podcast, our walk round Hyde Park. And then 2 days later, we got on Skype and we recorded this podcast. So look, have a great Christmas. I will speak to you in the new year. It's going to be a better one, isn't it? The first rule of 2021, never talk about 2020. I'll see you on January the 1st.